The evening was slowly turning darker as the street lights flickered to life one after another. Inside a small family-owned restaurant on the corner of the road, laughter and chatter filled the warm space. People were enjoying plates of hot food, sipping tea, and sharing conversations with their loved ones. The smell of freshly baked bread and roasted meat floated through the air. For most, it was just an ordinary evening. But for Daniel, it was far from ordinary. Daniel stood outside the restaurant door for several minutes, holding his little daughter Emma's tiny hand. His clothes were clean but old, his shoes slightly worn out, and his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He had worked small jobs throughout the week, trying to earn enough to survive. Yet, even after working tirelessly, he barely had enough money to buy a loaf of bread. Emma's soft voice broke his thoughts. "Daddy, I'm hungry," she whispered, looking up at him with innocent eyes that glowed in the light of the restaurant. Daniel forced a gentle smile, even though inside he felt a sharp pain. "I know, sweetheart," he said softly. "Let's go inside and see what we can do." They stepped into the restaurant, and Emma's eyes widened with excitement as she saw plates of food being carried to tables. The warmth of the place made her feel safe, and she squeezed her father's hand. Daniel looked around nervously. He knew he didn't have enough money for a full meal, maybe not even for the cheapest dish. He considered leaving, but Emma's hopeful eyes held him in place. At one corner of the restaurant, a woman sat alone. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her posture calm and confident. She was finishing her dinner, sipping water slowly as she glanced through her phone. This was Mrs. Collins, though Daniel didn't know her name yet. To everyone else, she appeared as just another customer. But in truth, she was a millionaire, a woman who had built her business empire with hard work and sharp vision. Daniel swallowed his pride. He had never begged in his life. Even in his hardest days, he tried to find a way through his own hands. But tonight was different. He had to think of Emma before himself. Gathering his courage, he walked toward the woman's table. Emma followed, her small steps echoing softly on the wooden floor. "Excuse me, ma'am," Daniel began, his voice polite but shaky. Mrs. Collins looked up from her phone, slightly surprised. His tone was respectful, not demanding. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "I don't mean to trouble you, but, could you please spare your leftovers? Just something for my daughter to eat." The room seemed to grow quiet in Daniel's mind, though in reality, people were still talking around him. He felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. Yet, when he looked at Emma, he knew he had done the right thing. Mrs. Collins blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. She studied him carefully. His eyes were tired but carried a quiet dignity. There was no greed in them, only a father's desperation to feed his child. She shifted her gaze to the little girl beside him. Emma stood shyly behind her father's leg, her bright eyes staring at the plate on the table with innocent hope. Instead of feeling annoyed, something stirred in Mrs. Collins' heart. She thought about the many times she had seen people asking for money, but this was different. This man wasn't asking for cash, nor was he demanding charity. He simply wanted food for his daughter. She gently set her phone aside. "What's your name?" she asked softly, her voice carrying kindness. Daniel was startled by the question. "My name is Daniel," he replied quietly. "And this is my daughter, Emma." Mrs. Collins smiled faintly at Emma, who gave a shy smile back. "She's beautiful," she said warmly. Emma blushed and buried her face against her father's arm. For a moment, silence settled between them. Mrs. Collins could have simply handed over her plate and walked away. But something told her to do more. She gestured toward the empty chairs at her table. "Why don't you both sit down?" she suggested gently. Daniel shook his head quickly. "No, no, I don't want to disturb you, ma'am. I only asked because she's hungry." We'll leave right after. But Mrs. Collins insisted, her tone calm yet firm. Please, sit down. Let me order fresh food for both of you. No child should go hungry while I sit here finishing my meal. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. He felt a mix of relief and hesitation. He didn't want to look like he was taking advantage, but the thought of Emma eating a proper meal made his heart ache with gratitude. Slowly, he nodded and guided Emma to the chair across from Mrs. Collins. When the waiter came, Mrs. Collins ordered a warm meal for Emma and Daniel. She didn't choose something fancy, just simple, wholesome food that a child would enjoy. As the plates arrived, the smell of fresh rice, vegetables, and roasted chicken filled the air. Emma's eyes lit up as the plate was placed in front of her. Go on, sweetheart, eat, Daniel whispered to his daughter, his voice almost trembling with emotion. Emma picked up her fork and began eating eagerly, smiling between bites. Daniel watched her, his chest heavy with relief. He had eaten nothing since the morning, but he didn't touch his plate at first. His focus was only on his daughter. Mrs. Collins noticed this and quietly pushed the plate closer to him. You should eat too, she said softly. Daniel hesitated again. I'm fine, he murmured. But Mrs. Collins shook her head. A father needs strength to take care of his child. Please. Daniel finally picked up his fork. As he ate slowly, his mind swirled with questions. Who was this woman? Why was she being so kind? He had expected maybe a sharp look, maybe a refusal, maybe embarrassment in front of strangers. Instead, he had found warmth. Mrs. Collins watched them quietly. She noticed the way Daniel let Emma eat first, the way he wiped her mouth gently with a tissue, the way his tired face softened whenever she smiled. She saw love, pure and unselfish, written all over his actions. And as she looked into Daniel's eyes again, she saw not weakness, but strength, the strength of a man who refused to give up, even when life had pushed him to the edge. The restaurant continued buzzing around them, but at that small corner table, a silent story was beginning to unfold, one that neither Daniel nor Mrs. Collins could have predicted. The warmth of the restaurant wrapped around them as Emma finished her meal with a satisfied smile. She licked a bit of sauce from her fingers, giggled softly, and then leaned against her father's arm, clearly full and content. Daniel stroked her hair gently, his tired face softening with every little laugh that came from his daughter. Mrs. Collins quietly observed the scene, her heart stirring in a way she hadn't expected. She was used to people asking her for favors, used to strangers pretending to be needy just to gain money. But Daniel's eyes, his tone, and his actions all told a different story. There was no greed, no trick. There was only honesty, love, and a father's sacrifice. She decided to know more. So, Daniel, she said in a calm voice, resting her hands on the table, tell me about yourself. What do you do? Daniel looked uncomfortable. He never liked sharing too much about his struggles, especially with strangers. He feared pity more than hunger. But there was something gentle in Mrs. Collins' tone, something that didn't feel judgmental. He lowered his eyes, took a deep breath, and spoke. I do whatever work I can find, he began slowly. Some days I help at construction sites. Other days I clean or carry goods at the market. I don't have one steady job, but I do whatever it takes to bring something home for Emma. Mrs. Collins listened without interrupting. Daniel's voice was calm, but beneath it lay years of exhaustion. He continued, his voice soft. Life wasn't always like this. I used to work in a small company. It wasn't much, but it was stable. And I had my wife by my side. She kept us together. But, 2 years ago, I lost her in a car accident. His voice broke slightly as he said the words. He paused, swallowing the pain that never truly left. Since then, it's just been me and Emma. I promised her mother that I'd take care of her no matter what. And that's what I'm trying to do, even if it means going hungry myself. Mrs. Collins felt her chest tighten. She glanced at Emma, who had now rested her head on the table, yawning softly. The little girl had no idea how much her father carried on his shoulders every day. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Collins said gently, her eyes softening. "That must have been very hard for you." Daniel forced a small smile, as if to hide his pain. "It's life. We can't control everything that happens. But I can control how I face it. I'd rather suffer quietly than let my daughter feel unloved or uncared for. She deserves better." Mrs. Collins leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. She was not just listening to his words, but also to his silence, the kind of silence that carried heavy burdens. She had met many people who had wealth but no heart, and here was a man who had nothing yet gave everything he had to his child. Curiosity grew inside her. She wanted to know what kept him going, what gave him the strength to face each day with so little. "Do you have family? Anyone who helps you?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "My parents passed away years ago. My wife's family, they live far away and have their own struggles. It's just the two of us." Mrs. Collins nodded slowly. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She thought of her own past, a memory that still lingered deep in her mind. She remembered a time when she too had faced difficult days, though perhaps not as harsh as Daniel's. She had known hunger, she had known fear of not making it through the month. But she had been given one chance, a single opportunity that changed everything. And now, sitting across from this man and his little girl, she felt as though life was placing a mirror in front of her. She saw in him the same determination she once had, the same refusal to surrender to hardship. "You know," she said softly, her voice carrying warmth, "the way you care for your daughter is remarkable. Many people in your position might give up or grow bitter. But you still have kindness in your eyes." Daniel looked surprised at her words. He wasn't used to being noticed like this. Most people ignored him or looked at him with pity. He cleared his throat and replied quietly, "I don't have much, but love doesn't cost anything. It's the only thing I can give her in abundance." Emma stirred in her seat, half asleep. Daniel gently picked her up in his arms, cradling her against his chest. She curled into him like she always did, feeling safe in her father's embrace. Mrs. Collins watched the scene with a soft gaze. She thought of all the business meetings she had attended, all the people she had met who spoke of success and wealth, yet none of them had shown the kind of wealth she was witnessing at this very moment. A strange feeling began to grow inside her. She didn't want this meeting to end. Something told her that this man's story wasn't supposed to pass by like a shadow in her life. She wanted to know more. She wanted to help. But she also knew Daniel was proud. He wouldn't accept pity, and if she offered too much too quickly, he might walk away. She decided to take small steps. "Daniel," she said after a moment of thought, "if you don't mind, I'd like to see you again. Maybe we can meet here another day. I'd like to talk more." Daniel was taken aback. He looked at her with confusion. "Why would you want to meet me again?" he asked honestly. Mrs. Collins smiled softly. "Because I admire people who don't give up. And because sometimes, stories like yours remind me of what truly matters. You've given me something to think about tonight." Daniel didn't know how to respond. A part of him wanted to refuse. After all, she was a stranger, and he didn't want to become a burden. But another part of him felt a strange sense of trust in her. He nodded slowly, still unsure. "All right," he said quietly. "If it doesn't trouble you." Mrs. Collins shook her head. "Not at all." She reached into her bag and took out a small piece of paper, writing her number on it. "Call me if you ever need to talk, or if you just want to share a cup of tea. No obligations, no expectations." She slid the paper toward him. Daniel looked at it for a long moment before tucking it carefully into his pocket. "Thank you," he said softly. His voice carried genuine gratitude, not just for the food, but for being treated with respect. As Daniel stood up, carrying Emma in his arms, Mrs. Collins watched him walk out of the restaurant. The image of his tired yet determined face lingered in her mind. She knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. She felt a quiet certainty that fate had brought them together for a reason. Outside, the cool night air brushed against Daniel's face. He looked down at Emma sleeping peacefully in his arms and then at the slip of paper in his pocket. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a small spark of hope. And deep inside, he knew that something had just shifted in his life, something that could change everything. The next few days passed quietly for Daniel. He continued working small jobs during the day, carrying heavy boxes at the market or helping with repairs wherever he could find work. Each evening, he returned home to their little rented room where Emma would wait with her bright smile and endless questions. Life was still hard, but the memory of that evening at the restaurant stayed with him. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the way the woman, Mrs. Collins, had looked at him with respect instead of pity. That feeling was rare in his life, and it gave him something to think about. One evening, while Emma sat at the small table drawing with her broken crayons, Daniel found the slip of paper in his pocket. Mrs. Collins' handwriting was neat, her number written clearly. He stared at it for a long time, unsure whether he should ever call. He didn't want to disturb her or appear as if he was depending on her kindness. But something told him that maybe she truly meant it when she asked him to stay in touch. He didn't call, but fate had its own plan. A week later, as he walked Emma home from school, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Daniel." He turned, surprised to see Mrs. Collins standing there, dressed simply but with the same graceful presence she had in the restaurant. She was holding a paper bag of groceries, and her smile was warm. "What a coincidence," she said. "I was just nearby and thought I might run into you." Emma's face lit up. "Hi," she said happily, recognizing the kind lady who had given her the delicious meal. Mrs. Collins bent down to her level, smiling. "Hello, Emma. How are you?" Emma giggled. "I'm good. Daddy got me new crayons." She proudly held up her small pouch. Mrs. Collins looked up at Daniel with a knowing smile. He seemed a little embarrassed, but she could see the pride in his eyes. He had probably sacrificed something for himself to buy those crayons, and she admired that deeply. They walked together for a while, chatting casually. Mrs. Collins asked about Emma's school, her favorite subjects, and what she liked to do. The little girl answered with the energy only children had, making both adults smile. Then, slowly, Mrs. Collins shifted the conversation toward Daniel. "Have you found steady work yet?" she asked gently. Daniel shook his head. "Not really. I go wherever I'm needed, but nothing stable. I've applied for jobs, but without higher education, it's difficult. Still, as long as I can put food on the table, that's what matters most." Mrs. Collins studied him quietly. She could see the weariness in his face but also the determination in his words. Many people in his place would have given up or grown bitter, but he still spoke with calm acceptance. That strength impressed her more than anything else. When they reached Daniel's small neighborhood, Mrs. Collins glanced at the narrow lanes, the simple houses, and the children playing in the street. She thought of her own journey, how she had once lived in a tiny apartment, working 3 jobs at a time just to pay rent. She remembered the hunger, the exhaustion, and the nights she wanted to give up. But then she remembered the moment someone had believed in her and given her a chance. That chance had changed everything. She stopped walking and looked at Daniel seriously. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel looked at her, a little cautious. "Of course. Would you be open to working in a more stable job?" Something where your effort will be valued and where you can grow. Daniel blinked, taken aback. Of course I would, he said quickly. That's all I want. A chance to prove myself. But, why do you ask? Mrs. Collins hesitated for a moment, then spoke honestly. Because I see something in you. You're hardworking, you're responsible, and you don't give up. People like you are rare. I might know a place where you could fit in. Daniel's heart began to beat faster. He didn't want to get his hopes up, but there was sincerity in her voice. What do you mean? He asked carefully. Mrs. Collins smiled gently. I own a few businesses. One of them could use someone like you. I'm not offering charity, Daniel. I'm offering an opportunity. The rest will depend on you, your effort, your honesty, your willingness to learn. If you're open to it, I can arrange an interview. For a long moment, Daniel didn't say anything. He felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, disbelief, hesitation, and hope. He had always taught himself not to expect miracles, but now, standing there, it felt as though life was handing him one. I don't know what to say, he finally whispered. Just say yes, Mrs. Collins replied softly. Say yes to the chance. The rest will be in your hands. Emma tugged at her father's sleeve. Daddy, you should say yes, she said innocently, not fully understanding but sensing something important. Daniel laughed softly, kissing her forehead. Then he looked at Mrs. Collins with sincerity in his eyes. Yes, he said. I'll take the chance. And I promise, I won't let you down. Mrs. Collins smiled, relieved. That's all I ask. I'll have my assistant call you tomorrow with the details. Just come as you are, Daniel. No need to pretend to be someone else. Who you are is already enough. As they parted ways that evening, Daniel carried Emma home with a lighter heart than he had felt in years. The idea of a real job, a stable future, seemed almost too good to be true. But he knew one thing for sure: he would give everything he had to prove himself worthy of the trust Mrs. Collins had placed in him. That night, after putting Emma to bed, Daniel sat by the small window of their room, looking up at the sky. The stars shone faintly above the city's lights. He thought of his wife, whispering into the night, I promised I'd take care of her. Maybe this is the start of keeping that promise. Meanwhile, in her large home across the city, Mrs. Collins sat by her desk, thinking of Daniel and Emma. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: a sense of purpose beyond business and wealth. Helping him didn't feel like charity, it felt like giving someone the chance she herself had once been given. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of something far greater than she had imagined. The morning of the interview arrived sooner than Daniel expected. He woke up early, long before the sun rose, and quietly prepared his clothes. He didn't own a suit or tie. All he had was a plain shirt that had been washed so many times its color had faded, and a pair of trousers that were slightly worn at the knees. He ironed them as best as he could and polished his shoes until they shone faintly. Looking into the small cracked mirror, he whispered to himself, this is enough. I just need to be myself. Emma, half asleep, rubbed her eyes and asked, Daddy, are you going to work today? Daniel smiled, brushing her hair back gently. Yes, sweetheart. Today is an important day. Wish me luck. Emma hugged him tightly. Good luck, Daddy. You're the best. Those words gave him more strength than anything else could. He kissed her forehead and left her with a kind neighbor who often looked after her when Daniel was away. Then he made his way across the city to the address Mrs. Collins had given him. When he arrived, he was stunned. The tall building stood proudly among other offices, its glass windows shining in the morning light. He hesitated for a moment at the entrance, feeling small in front of its size and elegance. But then he remembered Mrs. Collins' words, come as you are. Who you are is already enough. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. At the reception desk, a polite young woman greeted him. "You must be Mr. Daniel. We've been expecting you. Please, this way." Her words calmed him a little. He followed her into a spacious office where Mrs. Collins was waiting. She stood up with a welcoming smile. "Daniel, I'm glad you came. Thank you for giving me this chance," he said sincerely. She introduced him to a manager named Mr. Harris, who was in charge of one of her companies that dealt with logistics and supplies. The interview wasn't like the formal ones Daniel had feared. Instead, Mr. Harris asked him about his past experiences, how he managed tasks, how he dealt with problems, and what he wanted for the future. Daniel answered honestly, speaking about his years of doing hard labor, his ability to adapt, and his determination to provide stability for his daughter. What Daniel lacked in education, he made up for with sincerity and practical experience. Mr. Harris noticed this, and after a thoughtful pause, he nodded. "I think you'll do well here. We need people who are reliable and willing to work hard. You'll start as an assistant in our warehouse team. It's not an easy job, but if you put in effort, there will be opportunities to grow." Daniel's heart filled with relief. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Collins gave him an encouraging smile. "I told you you just needed a chance. The rest is in your hands." And so Daniel began his new job. The first few weeks were tough. He worked long hours at the warehouse, helping organize shipments, checking lists, and lifting boxes. But unlike the random jobs he had done before, this work was steady, and every evening he came home with the assurance that there would be food on the table. He was learning new skills to using computers to track inventory, managing schedules, and understanding the flow of business. At first, it was overwhelming, but Daniel refused to give up. Whenever he felt unsure, he reminded himself of Emma's smile and Mrs. Collins' faith in him. Slowly, his confidence grew. His colleagues noticed his dedication. He was always on time, always willing to stay late if needed, and never complained. He treated everyone with respect, whether they were senior staff or new workers. At home, Emma could see the difference. Her father no longer came back looking hopeless. He looked tired, yes, but there was a new light in his eyes. She loved hearing his stories about work, about the big trucks, the deliveries, and the people he worked with. She would clap her hands and say, "Daddy, you're amazing." Daniel laughed every time, but deep inside, those words gave him strength to keep going. Mrs. Collins often checked in quietly. She didn't interfere with his work but kept an eye on his progress through Mr. Harris. She would occasionally invite Daniel and Emma for dinner, where she listened to their stories and encouraged Emma in her studies. She never made them feel like charity cases. Instead, she treated them as equals, as people she respected. One evening, a few months later, Mrs. Collins invited them to her office. Emma played quietly with some books in the corner while Daniel sat across from her. "You've been doing well, Daniel," she said kindly. "Mr. Harris tells me you've become one of the most dependable people in the team." Daniel smiled modestly. "I just do what I can. I don't want to waste the opportunity you gave me." Mrs. Collins leaned forward. "And that's why I want to talk about the next step. How would you feel about taking on more responsibility? Learning to manage a small team?" Daniel's eyes widened. "Me? Manage others?" "Yes," she said firmly. "You've shown leadership without even realizing it. People follow your example. You work hard, you stay calm under pressure, and you care about doing things right. That's what a good leader does." Daniel hesitated. "I don't have formal education. I don't know if I'm ready." Mrs. Collins smiled. "Education is important, but character is more important. Skills can be learned, but honesty and dedication can't be taught. You already have what matters most." The rest you can learn on the way. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe in a brighter future. He agreed to the new role, determined to prove himself. Life began to change gradually. His income improved, and he was able to move with Emma into a slightly bigger apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, safe, and filled with warmth. He bought Emma a proper desk for her studies and even surprised her with a second-hand bicycle. Her laughter filled the rooms, turning the little apartment into a true home. Through all of this, Daniel never forgot where it had begun with a single act of kindness in a restaurant, when a stranger had looked into his eyes and chosen to see his dignity instead of his poverty. Mrs. Collins, on her side, often thought about that day too. Watching Daniel grow reminded her why she had once worked so hard to create something meaningful, not just for herself but for others too. Helping him didn't just change his life, it reminded her of the power of compassion. But their journey was far from over. Life still had lessons to teach both of them, and challenges would continue to appear. Yet what had started as a desperate request for leftovers was slowly transforming into a story of hope, resilience, and second chances. Years passed, and with them, Daniel's life slowly transformed. The man who once stood at a restaurant door, unsure if he could feed his daughter, was no longer the same. The warehouse job that had once seemed like a small step turned into a ladder he kept climbing, one steady effort at a time. Daniel had moved from being an assistant to becoming a supervisor, then later a manager trusted with greater responsibilities. Every stage brought new challenges, but he met them with the same dedication he had always shown. He studied at night, reading books about leadership, communication, and business so he could improve himself. He wasn't afraid to ask questions or learn from others, and in time, people respected him not only for his hard work but also for his humility. Emma grew up watching all of this. She saw how her father woke up early, worked tirelessly, and still found time to sit with her every evening, asking about her school, listening to her stories, and encouraging her dreams. She saw how he never gave up, even when tiredness weighed heavy on his shoulders. And because of that, she believed that anything was possible if one had patience and courage. Their home, once a single small room, had become a modest but warm apartment. Emma had her own little study space filled with books, colors, and notebooks. She loved drawing, and she loved writing little stories inspired by her father's journey. Sometimes she would leave them on his desk with a note that said, "You're my hero, Daddy." Daniel would always smile, his heart swelling with pride, each time he found one of those notes. Mrs. Collins remained a presence in their lives, though she never overstepped. She treated Daniel not as someone she had helped, but as a trusted colleague and a friend. Over the years, she had seen him become one of the pillars of her company, someone people looked up to. There were days when she called him into her office, not to give instructions, but simply to share a cup of tea and talk about life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in golden light, Mrs. Collins sat across from Daniel in her office. She had been reflecting on the years gone by and how far he had come. "Do you remember the first day we met?" she asked with a soft smile. Daniel laughed quietly. "How could I forget? I had nothing in my pocket but a few coins, and I was desperate enough to ask a stranger for leftovers." Mrs. Collins shook her head gently. "But what I remember most is not your request. It was the look in your eyes. You weren't begging. You were holding on to dignity, even in pain. That's what made me stop and listen." Daniel grew quiet. He thought of that day often, not with shame but with gratitude. "That moment changed everything," he admitted. "You saw something in me when I couldn't even see it in myself." Mrs. Collins leaned forward. "No, Daniel. You already had it inside you. All I did was open a door. You were the one who walked through it, step by step." Daniel smiled humbly, but his heart was full. He knew her words were true. Nothing had come easily, but with each opportunity, he had worked harder, never forgetting why he was doing it for Emma, for the promise he had made to her mother, and for the life he wanted to build. Years later, Emma stood proudly at her high school graduation, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found her father. Daniel clapped the loudest, his heart swelling with emotion. He remembered the days when even a pencil and notebook had been difficult to afford, and now his daughter stood on stage, ready to step into a future filled with possibilities. Mrs. Collins sat beside him, sharing in his pride. After the ceremony, Emma hugged her father tightly. "Daddy," she whispered, "you kept your promise to Mom. You gave me everything I needed." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "I only gave you love, Emma. The rest, you achieved on your own." But deep inside, he knew it wasn't just love he had given. He had given her an example, the example of resilience, honesty, and never giving up. Emma later received a scholarship for college. As she packed her bags for the next chapter of her life, Daniel stood by the doorway, watching her with mixed feelings. He was proud, but a part of him also felt the quiet ache of seeing his little girl grow up so fast. She hugged him and said, "Don't worry, Daddy. I'll make you even prouder." He smiled. "You already have, every single day." Time moved forward, and Daniel's role in the company grew even larger. He became a trusted leader, guiding new employees and mentoring those who struggled. He never forgot where he came from, so he always treated everyone with kindness and respect. To him, every worker mattered, whether they were carrying boxes in the warehouse or sitting in the boardroom. He also began to quietly help others. When he saw young men or women struggling the way he once had, he didn't turn away. Sometimes he offered advice, sometimes a small opportunity, sometimes just a kind word. He knew how much difference one chance could make, and he wanted to pass that gift forward. Mrs. Collins often watched this with quiet pride. She had seen Daniel's journey from the very beginning, and now she knew without doubt that her decision to trust him had been one of the best she had ever made. He wasn't just an employee, he was proof that kindness could create ripples far greater than one could imagine. On a quiet evening, years after their first meeting, Daniel sat with Emma in their home. She had returned from college for the holidays, her arms full of books, her face glowing with excitement about her studies. As they sat together, she asked him, "Daddy, do you ever think about that day at the restaurant?" Daniel chuckled softly. "Almost every day. Not because I'm ashamed, but because it reminds me of how far we've come. That one moment, that one act of kindness, changed the entire course of our lives." Emma smiled thoughtfully. "Maybe one day, I'll write about it. Not just as our story, but as a reminder that people should never underestimate the power of compassion." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining. "That would be beautiful. And I know your mother would be proud." The night grew quiet around them, but in that silence, there was peace. A father who had once begged for leftovers now lived with dignity, respect, and hope. A daughter who had once gone hungry now dreamed of a future filled with opportunity. And a woman who had once looked into a stranger's eyes had found one of the most meaningful connections of her life. It all began with a simple question in a restaurant. A single moment where compassion met resilience, where dignity met kindness. And from that moment, a new story was written, not of pity, but of hope, faith, and the power of believing in one another.